Sometimes the moments that break our hearts are the ones we never see coming. And I want to share something with you today that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it, even though it happened years ago now. This is one of those stories that starts with hope and ends with lessons learned the hard way. And maybe somewhere in here, you'll find a piece of yourself or someone you know. Because isn't that what we all do when we hear about someone else's journey through the valleys? We thought only we had to walk through alone. My name is Sarah, and I was 32 years old when this all happened, married to a man I'll call David, though that's not his real name, living in a quiet suburb just outside of Phoenix where the houses all look similar and everyone waves at each other from their driveways on Saturday mornings. We had been married for almost 9 years at that point, and if you had asked me back then if I thought my marriage was solid, I would have said yes without hesitation. The way you do when you're still living in the before times, before everything you thought you knew gets turned completely upside down and inside out. David and I had been trying to have a baby for nearly 4 years, which is a long time when you think about it. 4 whole years of hoping and praying and scheduling and disappointment, month after month after month. We'd done the fertility treatments, the ones where you give yourself injections in your belly and your hormones go absolutely wild, making you cry at television commercials and feel like your body isn't quite your own anymore. We'd spent thousands of dollars that we really couldn't afford, putting off vacations and new furniture and all the normal things couples do because we were chasing this one dream that seemed to keep slipping further and further away from us with every negative test. So when that stick finally showed two pink lines on a Tuesday morning in March, I felt like my whole world had shifted into Technicolor after years of black and white. Remember standing in our bathroom, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the test, staring at those two lines like they might disappear if I blinked too hard. I was crying and laughing at the same time, which probably looked ridiculous, and I kept thinking about how I was going to tell David, planning this perfect moment in my head where he would sweep me up in his arms and spin me around the way they do in movies. That morning, when he came downstairs for breakfast, I had the test wrapped in a little box with a ribbon, and I set it next to his coffee mug with my heart absolutely pounding in my chest. I watched his face as he opened it, and for just a second, I saw something I thought was joy. This flash of brightness in his eyes that made me think everything was going to be exactly how I'd imagined it. He hugged me and said all the right things, told me he was happy, told me this was what we'd been waiting for, and I believed every single word because why wouldn't I? This was the man I loved, the man I'd chosen to build a life with. But looking back now, I can see that the signs were there from almost the very beginning. Little things I told myself didn't matter because I was so focused on the miracle growing inside me that I didn't want to see anything that might dim that light. When I would bring up baby names at dinner, David would kind of nod and change the subject to something about work or a project he was working on in the garage. When I showed him pictures of nursery ideas I'd been saving on my phone, he'd glance at them for maybe 2 seconds before saying something like, "Yeah, that looks fine," without really looking at all. By the time I was 3 months along, I started noticing that David seemed to avoid me whenever I was feeling sick. Morning sickness is such a misleading term, by the way, because mine lasted all day and well into the night. And there were days when I could barely keep water down, much less actual food. I would be in the bathroom with my head over the toilet, and David would call through the door asking if I was almost done because he needed to get ready for work. Like my throwing up was somehow inconveniencing his schedule rather than being a normal part of growing our child. The morning everything changed was a Saturday in June, and I remember it was one of those brutally hot Arizona days where the air shimmers above the pavement and you can feel the heat radiating up through your shoes. I had been sick all night, barely sleeping, and when I came downstairs for breakfast, David was already at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs in front of him. I tried to eat some crackers, those plain saltines that were the only things that didn't immediately make my stomach revolt. And I mentioned to David that I was feeling really nauseated again, just making conversation the way married people do, sharing the mundane details of our days. He slammed his coffee mug down so hard on the table that coffee sloshed over the rim and onto the wood, and the sound made me jump because it was so sudden, so unexpected, like a door slamming in the middle of a quiet room. He looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, his face twisted up in disgust, and he said words that I can still hear perfectly clear in my mind even now, years later. He said, "Sarah, I'm so sick of hearing about your disgusting pregnancy symptoms. You've become completely boring and gross, and all you ever talk about is how sick you are and how tired you are and how pregnant you are, and I'm done listening to it. Just stop talking about the pregnancy entirely. I don't want to hear another word about it." sat there frozen with a half-eaten cracker in my hand, feeling like someone had just thrown ice water over me, and I couldn't quite process what he just said because it didn't make any sense with the life I thought we were living together. This was the baby we'd tried for, the baby we'd spent years hoping and praying for, and now he was calling my pregnancy disgusting, like I was doing something shameful instead of carrying our child. Remember my eyes filling with tears, and I tried to say something, tried to ask him what he meant or why he was so angry, but the words wouldn't come out right, and he just went back to his phone like the conversation was over, like he hadn't just broken something fundamental between us. I put the crackers down very carefully, stood up from the table without saying anything, and walked upstairs to our bedroom where I sat on the edge of the bed and cried until my throat hurt and my eyes were swollen. All I could think about was those 4 years of trying, all those injections and appointments and disappointments, and how we'd supposedly been in this together, wanting the same thing, building toward the same dream. And now that the dream was finally happening, he was calling it disgusting, calling me boring, telling me to stop talking about the very thing we'd worked so hard to achieve. That afternoon, I packed a bag with enough clothes for a few days and drove to my parents' house about 45 minutes away in Scottsdale. And when my mom opened the door and saw my face, she just pulled me inside and held me while I cried all over again, trying to explain what David had said between sobs that made it hard to breathe. My dad was furious, pacing around the living room and saying things about driving over there and having a conversation with David man to man. But my mom calmed him down and made me some tea with honey, and we all sat in their kitchen while I tried to make sense of something that felt completely senseless. Told myself I would only stay a few days, just until David realized what he'd said and apologized, until things could go back to normal, whatever normal meant anymore. But he didn't call that night or the next day, and when he finally did send me a text on the third day, all it said was, "When are you coming home?" Like I was just away on a casual visit and not dealing with the aftermath of him telling me my pregnancy disgusted him. Replied simply with the word soon and left it at that, and I could almost feel his confusion through the phone. But I didn't elaborate because he had specifically told me to stop talking about the pregnancy, and that's exactly what I was going to do. The thing about taking someone at their word is that it requires a level of commitment that most people aren't prepared for. And I was committed in a way that probably only makes sense when you've been hurt as deeply as I had been hurt that Saturday morning. David had said, stop talking about the pregnancy, and so I stopped, completely and totally cutting him off from every single detail and update and moment of this experience that he'd said disgusted him so much. If he didn't want to hear about it, then he wouldn't hear about it, and I would follow his instructions to the absolute letter, even if it meant he missed everything. My parents were incredibly supportive during those weeks I stayed with them, and my mom would go with me to all my prenatal appointments, sitting in the waiting room with magazines she never actually read while I went in and got measured and weighed and listened to the heartbeat that sounded like horses galloping. The doctor asked where my husband was, and I just said he was working, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. And she accepted it without pushing because I think she could see something in my face that said this was not a topic I wanted to discuss right then. David's texts became more frequent after that first week, asking what was happening and if everything was okay and when I was planning to come back home. I would respond with simple one-word answers or short phrases that gave him nothing. No details about doctor appointments or how the baby was growing or how I was feeling. Nothing that could be construed as talking about the pregnancy he'd told me to shut up about. After about 2 weeks, his messages took on this frantic quality, like he was starting to realize that something was very wrong but couldn't quite put his finger on what it was or how to fix it. The neighbors on our street apparently noticed my extended absence and started asking David where I was. And from what I heard later through the grapevine of neighborhood gossip, nobody believed his explanations that I was just visiting family. People started whispering that we must be separated, that David had driven away his pregnant wife, and pretty soon the whole cul-de-sac was talking about it whenever someone walked their dog past our house or checked the mail at the community mailboxes. David was furious about the gossip, but what could he say that wouldn't make him look worse? Because the truth was exactly what people suspected. He had driven me away by calling my pregnancy disgusting. By week 4 of staying with my parents, David started showing up at their house unannounced, ringing the doorbell and knocking on the door and calling through the wood asking me to please just talk to him and tell him what was going on. My dad would go to the door and tell him I was resting and couldn't be disturbed right now, and David would stand there on the porch looking lost and confused, asking what he'd done wrong, seeming to have completely forgotten that morning in the kitchen when he told me to stop talking about being pregnant. Around that same time, my sister Rebecca decided to throw me a baby shower at the country club where she was a member. One of those fancy afternoon affairs with finger sandwiches and pastel decorations, and games where people guess how big around your belly is with ribbon. She scheduled it for a Saturday in August when David had his company's annual golf tournament, and she did it deliberately because she was furious with him on my behalf and didn't want him there ruining my celebration. The shower was absolutely beautiful, and I felt so loved and supported by all the women who came, friends from high school and college and my mom's book club, all bringing gifts and good wishes and telling me how excited they were for me to become a mother. What made the shower even more interesting was that David's boss's wife, a lovely woman named Patricia, was also a member of the country club and had been invited by my sister, who knew her through mutual friends. Patricia brought an incredibly generous gift, this top-of-the-line stroller that must have cost at least $600. And she asked very sweetly where David was that day. My sister, never one to mince words, explained that David had told me to stop talking about my pregnancy because it disgusted him. And so he wasn't exactly involved in any of the planning or celebration. The look on Patricia's face went from pleasant to horrified in about 3 seconds flat, and I could see her mentally filing away this information to discuss with her husband later. Apparently, Patricia didn't waste any time, because that very afternoon, while David was on the seventh hole of his golf tournament, his boss pulled him aside and asked him point blank what kind of man tells his pregnant wife that she disgusts him. David had to finish the entire tournament with every single person in his foursome knowing what he'd said to me, all of them giving him these looks of disgust and disappointment. And according to someone who was there, he played terribly, hitting ball after ball into the water hazards and sand traps because he couldn't concentrate with everyone staring at him like he was some kind of monster. The gifts from the shower filled up half of my old bedroom at my parents' house. And David's mother, my mother-in-law Jennifer, had sent a beautiful handmade quilt she'd spent months working on, every stitch done with love and care. What made this particularly painful for David was that Jennifer had found out about the shower from my mother, who she'd run into at the grocery store, and not from her own son, who hadn't bothered to mention it was happening. Jennifer called David that night and apparently tore into him about how disappointed she was. How she'd raised him better than this, how could he treat his pregnant wife this way, and why was she hearing about her grandchild's baby shower from someone else instead of him? The calls from David became daily after that, with him leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading to confused, asking me to please just give him updates about the pregnancy and the baby and tell him what was happening with his child. I would listen to these messages with absolutely no emotion on my face. And then I would delete them because he'd specifically instructed me not to talk about the pregnancy. And I was simply following his instructions exactly as he'd given them. When I was about 32 weeks along, I started having some concerning symptoms, cramping and back pain that felt different from the normal aches and discomforts of pregnancy. My mom drove me to the hospital at 2 in the morning, and after monitoring me for several hours, the doctors determined I was having premature labor contractions and put me on strict bed rest to try to keep the baby in for as long as possible. I spent 4 days in the hospital hooked up to monitors that tracked every heartbeat and every contraction, lying still and trying not to panic about the possibility of my baby being born too early. My dad called David's office to let his secretary know what was happening, thinking surely David would want to know that I was hospitalized, that this was serious, that our baby might be coming months too soon. But apparently, David never mentioned to anyone at work that his wife was in the hospital, never asked for time off or changed his schedule, just kept going about his normal business like nothing was happening. When his secretary later found out the details, she was absolutely horrified that he'd known and hadn't even bothered to visit or check on me. David did eventually show up at the hospital, bursting into my room 3 days after I'd been admitted, and he looked frantic and angry and scared all at the same time. He grabbed my hand and demanded to know why I hadn't called him myself, why he'd had to hear from his secretary that his wife was in the hospital, what was happening with the baby. Were we okay? Was everything all right? I looked at him with the calmest expression I could manage and said very simply, "You told me not to talk about the pregnancy," and then I turned my head away from him and looked at the wall. The bed rest situation became even more complicated when they discharged me with instructions to stay horizontal as much as possible for the remainder of the pregnancy. David found out about this when he came home from work one Thursday evening to discover a hospital bed had been delivered and set up in our living room, complete with adjustable rails and a special mattress. And I was lying in it, watching television, while my mom sat nearby reading a magazine. He just stood in the doorway with his briefcase still in his hand, staring at this hospital bed like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. And then he asked what was happening, was the baby okay, how long had I known about this, why didn't anyone tell him? I didn't answer any of his questions, just kept watching my show like he wasn't even there. And my mom very politely informed him that I was on strict bed rest until delivery and she would be staying with us to help take care of me since I couldn't do much for myself. David looked like he wanted to argue or demand explanations, but what could he possibly say in front of my mother who knew exactly what he'd said to me that Saturday morning months ago? He went upstairs to our bedroom and I heard him punching the wall, that hollow thud of fist hitting drywall, and then silence. The delivery men who'd set up the hospital bed had been very chatty with our neighbors apparently, explaining to anyone who would listen about the poor pregnant lady whose husband was never around to help her. And pretty soon, more people on our street were giving David cold shoulders and disapproving looks whenever he got his mail or left for work in the morning. Someone even left a note on his car windshield calling him a deadbeat, and another neighbor told him to his face that he should be ashamed of himself for abandoning his pregnant wife. My mother, who has always been somewhat active on social media, started posting updates about the pregnancy on her Facebook page, talking about how she was so grateful to be able to support her daughter through this difficult time since her daughter's husband found pregnancy disgusting and didn't want to hear about it. Those posts went absolutely viral in our local community, getting shared hundreds of times, with people my mom didn't even know commenting about what a terrible man David must be and how lucky I was to have such supportive parents. David saw these posts, of course, and he created several fake accounts trying to comment that people didn't know the whole story, that I was refusing to talk to him, that he'd apologized and wanted to be involved, but nobody believed him or cared what he had to say. The situation with David's family got even worse when his brother Michael called me asking if it would be okay for him to be the baby's godfather, since David wasn't exactly stepping up to his responsibilities as a father. I told David I very quietly got out of the hospital bed, trying not to wake David, who was asleep upstairs, and I called my mom, who was back at her own house for the night. She arrived. David woke up at his normal time around 6:30 that morning, got dressed in his usual work clothes, ate his usual breakfast, and drove to his office without ever checking to see if I was downstairs or noticing that the hospital bed was empty. He spent the entire day in meetings and phone calls, answering emails and reviewing reports, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was in labor and his daughter was being born. It wasn't until almost 4 in the afternoon when Rebecca came to our house with congratulations balloons that our doorbell camera sent David a notification on his phone, and he saw her walking up to the porch carrying pink and white balloons that said, "It's a girl," in sparkly letters. He called me immediately, and I was still in the recovery room surrounded by nurses and my parents, holding my brand new baby girl who was perfect and tiny and had the most beautiful dark hair. Answered the phone on speaker because I was too tired to hold it up to my ear, and David's voice came through frantic and angry, demanding to know why I hadn't told him I was in labor. How could I not call him? What was I thinking, keeping him away from his own child's birth? I replied very calmly and clearly so everyone in the room could hear, "You told me to stop talking about the pregnancy, so I did exactly what you asked." And then I hung up while the nurses stood there with their mouths hanging open in shock. The head nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and 20 years of experience, actually said out loud, "I cannot believe what I just heard. What kind of father doesn't want to know his baby is being born?" And the other nurses murmured in agreement while checking my vitals and helping me get comfortable. Within an hour, David came bursting into my hospital room looking like he'd run from the parking lot, his tie askew and his hair messy. And he was breathing hard like he'd taken the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. He rushed over to the bed where I was holding our daughter, and he started to reach for her, but then he stopped and pulled out his phone, holding it up to record. He looked directly at the camera on his phone and said very clearly, "I want everyone to know that my wife deliberately kept me away from my daughter's birth. She didn't tell me she went into labor. She didn't call when the baby was born. She purposely excluded me from one of the most important moments of my life. And I have witnesses here who can confirm what she did." The nurses all froze, the room went completely silent except for the soft beeping of monitors, and my mom pulled our baby out of my arms and backed away into the corner of the room like she was protecting her granddaughter from a threat. Then David did something that made my blood run cold. Something I never would have expected from the man I'd married almost a decade ago. He smiled, this calculating cold smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he said, "Now we're going to discuss custody arrangements because what you did constitutes parental alienation and my lawyer has already drawn up the papers. He pulled out a thick manila envelope from his jacket pocket and dropped it on my bedside table with a heavy thud, and inside were legal documents requesting emergency custody based on my alleged interference with his parental rights. His lawyer, a slick looking man in an expensive suit, walked into the room right behind David and started explaining in this professional monotone voice that I had 7 days to respond to the filing and that they had substantial evidence of me deliberately keeping David away from his daughter. The lawyer mentioned the recording David just made as proof of my admission, and he talked about establishing a custody arrangement that would protect David's rights as a father going forward. All while I sat there in my hospital bed, still bleeding from having just given birth 4 hours ago, trying to process the fact that I might lose my baby to a man who'd called my pregnancy disgusting. Rebecca was already on her phone frantically calling people, and I could hear her leaving urgent messages for lawyer friends and anyone she thought might be able to help. My mom stood in the corner still holding my daughter, this tiny, perfect being who didn't know that her life was about to become a battlefield between her parents, and she had tears streaming down her face as she whispered soft reassurances to the baby who was starting to fuss. The nurses looked completely shocked by what was happening, and one of them went to press the call button while another stepped between David and my bed like she was creating a physical barrier. Security arrived within minutes, two large men in uniform who asked David and his lawyer to leave immediately because visiting hours were over and I was still recovering from delivery and needed rest. David's lawyer tried to argue that they had every right to be there, that this was David's daughter, and he deserved to see her. But the security guards were having none of it and basically escorted both men out of the room while David yelled back at me that this wasn't over and he'd see me in court. The door clicked shut behind them, and I just sat there staring at the legal documents on my table, feeling like my whole world had just shattered into a million pieces. That evening after the hospital discharged me because they don't let you stay very long anymore unless there are complications, I found myself sitting in my parents' living room holding my daughter, who I'd named Emma, though that's not her real name, while Rebecca's friend from college, an attorney named Catherine Harris, who specialized in family law, spread David's papers across the coffee table. Catherine listened to the recording David had made at the hospital 3 separate times, making notes on a yellow legal pad. And then she looked up at me with this small, knowing smile and said that context was absolutely everything in family court. She explained that one isolated recording of me admitting I didn't call David about the labor wouldn't override months and months of documented evidence showing exactly why I'd gone silent about the pregnancy in the first place. Catherine pulled out her laptop and started creating what she called our defense strategy, beginning with gathering every single text message David had sent me during the pregnancy, every voicemail where he begged me to talk to him about the baby after explicitly telling me not to, every piece of evidence that showed his original cruel words and my subsequent justified silence. Rebecca had already started compiling screenshots in a cloud folder, everything from David's fake social media accounts, trying to defend himself, to his increasingly frantic messages asking when I was coming home. We had my mom's viral Facebook posts about being my only support system during the pregnancy, statements from multiple neighbors who'd witnessed David's behavior and absence, documentation of the baby shower he'd missed at the country club, and testimony from his own mother about how he'd never told her any details about the pregnancy or impending birth. Catherine spent almost 4 hours at my parents' house that night, methodically documenting every detail of the past 8 months, creating a timeline that showed clearly how this situation had developed and whose fault it really was. She made notes about how David's boss had confronted him at the golf tournament after learning what he'd said to me, about his grandmother's reaction at that family dinner, about the premature labor scare when he hadn't even visited me in the hospital, about everything that painted a picture of a man who'd emotionally abandoned his pregnant wife and was now trying to play the victim. 3 days later, Catherine called to warn me that David had filed an additional motion claiming I had severe postpartum depression and wasn't mentally stable enough to care for Emma properly. This was David's new strategy, painting me as unstable and unfit, trying to twist the narrative so he looked like the concerned father instead of the man who'd created this entire mess with his cruelty. I was furious and terrified at the same time because how do you defend yourself against accusations of mental illness, especially when you're genuinely stressed and exhausted from having a newborn and facing a custody battle? My dad came home from work absolutely livid that week because he'd run into someone who worked with David at the grocery store, and this person had asked if it was true that I'd kidnapped the baby and wasn't letting David see his own daughter. David had been spreading lies throughout his entire office, telling people I was keeping Emma away from him, that I'd stolen her from the hospital, that I was unstable and vindictive and using our daughter as a weapon. The gossip had spread through his company like wildfire, and people who didn't know the truth were starting to feel sorry for David and see him as this poor, victimized father instead of the man who'd brought all of this on himself. Catherine filed our response with the court the following Monday, and it was a document I will never forget. 43 pages of meticulously detailed evidence that told the complete story from beginning to end. She included sworn statements from 3 different nurses who'd witnessed David's behavior in the hospital room when he came in with his lawyer and recording device. She subpoenaed footage from our home security cameras showing how rarely David had been home during my entire pregnancy. All those nights when he'd left early in the morning and not returned until after midnight while I was on strict bed rest and completely alone. The doorbell camera footage was particularly damning, showing the delivery company arriving to install the hospital bed while David was at work in the middle of the day, proving he had no idea it was even happening because he was so disconnected from what was going on with his pregnant wife. We included the invoice from the medical supply company with timestamps and delivery confirmations that made it impossible for David to claim he'd known about the bed rest situation. Every piece of evidence built on the previous one, creating an undeniable pattern of neglect and abandonment. Then something happened that I truly never expected, something that changed the entire trajectory of the custody case. Jennifer, David's mother, called me one Thursday afternoon crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying at first. Through her tears, she explained that she'd had no idea what David had really said to me about the pregnancy being disgusting, that she'd believed him when he told her I was just being hormonal and dramatic, that pregnant women sometimes get upset over nothing. But she'd talked to my mother, gotten the full story, heard the truth about that morning in the kitchen and everything that came after, and she was absolutely horrified by her son's behavior. Jennifer told me she wanted to testify on my behalf, that she was ashamed of how David had treated me and our daughter, that she couldn't stand by and watch him try to manipulate the court system to cover up his own cruelty. She said she'd already written out a detailed statement about the baby shower incident, about how David had never told her it was happening and she'd found out from my mother instead, about his complete disconnection from the pregnancy and preparations for the baby. Having David's own mother willing to testify against him was huge, Catherine said, because judges pay attention when family members cross that line. 2 weeks after Emma was born, we went to her first pediatric checkup, and I must have looked absolutely exhausted because the doctor took one look at my face and asked me very gently what was going on in my life. I explained about the custody battle, about David's threats, about fighting to keep my daughter while also trying to be a new mother and recover from childbirth and deal with all the stress that comes with legal proceedings. The pediatrician examined Emma very thoroughly, checking her weight and her reflexes and her overall development, and then she sat down at her computer and spent a solid 10 minutes typing. She printed out a detailed letter on official hospital letterhead stating that Emma was thriving under my care, gaining weight at exactly the right pace, meeting all her developmental milestones perfectly, showing absolutely zero signs of neglect or inadequate care, or any of the things David was trying to claim in his filings. The doctor made multiple copies of this letter, handed them to me for my lawyer, and told me she would absolutely testify in court if needed about Emma's excellent health and my clearly competent parenting. This was exactly the kind of professional medical opinion that could counter David's claims about me being unfit. That same night, I was sitting in the nursery feeding Emma at 2 in the morning, that quiet time when it feels like you're the only 2 people awake in the entire world, when my phone started buzzing with notification after notification from Facebook. I picked it up one-handed while Emma nursed, and what I saw made my stomach drop. David had posted in 3 different fathers' rights groups on social media, writing these long emotional posts about how his evil ex-wife was keeping his newborn daughter away from him, how he'd missed her first precious weeks of life because I refused to let him visit, how the family court system was completely broken and biased against fathers. Within an hour of his posts going up, I had dozens of angry messages flooding my inbox from complete strangers. Men I'd never met calling me every horrible name you can imagine, threatening me, telling me I was exactly what's wrong with women today, saying I deserved to lose custody, and worse. These messages got increasingly violent and scary as the night went on, and by morning, David's original post had been shared over 200 times by angry men in various online groups who were all convinced I was this terrible person keeping a devoted father away from his child. Someone in the comments found my LinkedIn profile and posted my workplace information, and another person posted photos of my parents' house from Google Street View, writing, "This is where she's hiding with the baby." And I felt this cold wave of terror wash over me because now strangers on the internet knew where I was staying. Rebecca screenshot every single message and post and comment while I blocked account after account, but they just kept coming like a flood I couldn't stop. Catherine filed for an emergency restraining order that very same day, printing out pages and pages of these threatening messages and harassment. The judge who reviewed our emergency request read through maybe the first 10 pages of screenshots before she looked up with this expression of complete disgust on her face, and she granted the temporary restraining order immediately without any hesitation. She ordered David to stay 500 feet away from me, Emma, and my parents until our custody hearing, and she also ordered him to remove every single social media post about me or our daughter within 24 hours or face contempt charges. The judge's firmness gave me hope that maybe the system would actually protect us, that someone in authority could see through David's manipulation. My sister spent the entire following week creating the most comprehensive timeline I'd ever seen in my life, going all the way back to when we'd first announced the pregnancy 3 years into our fertility struggles. Rebecca had systematically gone through David's Facebook and Instagram accounts, printing out screenshots of his posts from when we'd first gotten that positive test, back when he was still pretending to be excited about becoming a father. His early posts were all about future fatherhood and dreams for our child, standard stuff that made him look like a normal, expectant father. But then Rebecca showed me month by month how his posts changed and evolved, or rather devolved, as the pregnancy progressed. By my second trimester, when I was starting to show and dealing with all the uncomfortable symptoms, David never mentioned the pregnancy at all on social media. Not once, like it simply wasn't happening. During my third trimester, when I was huge and miserable and on bed rest, his posts showed him at bars with friends, playing golf, attending sporting events, living his life like he was a single man without any responsibilities, waiting at home. She found multiple instances where friends and family members had commented on his posts asking about the baby or how the pregnancy was going. And David had either completely ignored those questions or given vague non-answers that revealed nothing. The contrast was absolutely striking when laid out chronologically in a binder with color-coded tabs for each month. And Catherine said it was some of the best evidence she'd ever seen for showing a pattern of disengagement and neglect. The following week, David's lawyer filed a motion demanding access to all of my medical records, claiming they needed to verify my mental state and determine whether I was fit to care for Emma. The motion specifically mentioned possible postpartum psychosis and suggested I might be a danger to my own daughter, which was so outrageous and insulting that I actually laughed out loud when Catherine read it to me over the phone. This was clearly a fishing expedition, trying to find something, anything they could use against me, but Catherine was ready to fight it tooth and nail. At the hearing specifically about the medical records request, David's lawyer argued that they had a right to know whether I was mentally stable enough to be a primary caregiver, that Emma's safety might be at risk if I was suffering from untreated postpartum depression or worse. Catherine countered beautifully, pointing out that we'd already provided the pediatrician's letter showing Emma was thriving, that there was no evidence whatsoever of inadequate care, and that this was purely a harassment tactic designed to intimidate me. The judge listened to both arguments and then made a Solomon-like decision, saying David's lawyer could access my medical records from after Emma's birth, but nothing from during the pregnancy or before, limiting their fishing expedition somewhat. Catherine immediately scheduled me with a therapist that same week, wanting to get ahead of whatever David was planning with the mental health angle. The therapist she recommended was someone named Dr. Patricia Chen, who'd testified as an expert witness in multiple custody cases and understood exactly what was at stake. I spent 3-hour-long sessions with Dr. Chen, telling her everything from our fertility struggles through David's cruel words to the current custody battle, and she listened carefully while taking detailed notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. Dr. Chen ran several standard psychological evaluations on me, the kind where you answer hundreds of questions about your mood and thoughts and behaviors. And at the end of our third session, she showed me her report. It stated very clearly and professionally that, yes, I was experiencing stress, but it was completely situational stress related to the custody battle and not any kind of underlying mental health disorder. She wrote that my stress reactions were totally normal and appropriate for someone facing legal threats and harassment from an ex-spouse. And she documented evidence of healthy bonding with Emma and meeting all of her needs consistently. 2 days after my final session with Dr. Chen, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, David's brother Michael was on the other end, sounding upset and uncomfortable. He told me that David had called him the previous night asking him to sign a statement, a legal document that would say Michael had witnessed me refusing to let David see Emma at the hospital. But that wasn't what happened, Michael said. That wasn't the truth at all, and David had actually offered to pay him $5,000 to lie in a sworn statement to commit perjury in a custody case. Michael said he'd refused immediately and told David he was disgusting for even asking, for trying to bribe his own brother into lying in court, and that he wanted to testify for me instead about how David had really acted during the pregnancy. He told me about conversations where David had complained constantly about how gross pregnancy was, about how I'd gotten fat and boring, about how he couldn't wait for everything to go back to normal. Catherine added Michael to our witness list right away because having David's own brother willing to testify against him would be incredibly powerful in front of a judge. That same weekend, Catherine called me with news from the private investigator she'd hired to look into David's current living situation and activities. What the investigator found was worse than I'd imagined. David had been living with a woman from his office, someone named Stephanie, since literally the day Emma was born. The investigator had photos of David carrying boxes into Stephanie's apartment, his car parked in her driveway every single night, the two of them going to restaurants together, her wearing a necklace that our credit card statement showed David had purchased just days after Emma's birth. But the investigator kept digging and found something even more damning. Through a mutual friend who was disgusted by David's behavior and willing to share information, the investigator obtained text messages between David and Stephanie that dated back months, all the way back to when I was on bed rest with pregnancy complications. These messages showed David complaining about being stuck with a pregnant wife, making plans for when he'd be free, talking about our marriage being over, all while I was lying in that hospital bed trying to keep our daughter safe until she could be born healthy. There were photos the investigator found of David and Stephanie at an expensive steakhouse on the very night I was in the hospital with premature labor contractions, enjoying wine and appetizers while I was hooked up to monitors, terrified our baby might come too soon. Another photo showed them kissing in David's car in a parking lot while I was 8 months pregnant and enormous and alone at home on strict bed rest. Stephanie had even posted on her Instagram about her new man with photos of David while I was in my 3rd trimester. And these posts were still up online for anyone to see. Catherine said this evidence would absolutely destroy any claim David tried to make about being a devoted father who wanted to be involved, because you can't claim to care about your pregnant wife and unborn child while you're literally starting a relationship with someone else and planning your escape. The timeline was damning, the photos were undeniable, and the text messages showed intent and premeditation that would make any judge question David's credibility about everything. Jennifer, David's mother, called Catherine's office directly a few days later, getting the phone number from my mom, and asked if she could provide additional testimony beyond her written statement. She told Catherine she wanted to talk about the family dinner where she'd literally written David out of her will, where she and David's father and his aunts and uncles had all confronted him about his treatment of me, and he'd shown absolutely no remorse whatsoever. Jennifer described how David had actually laughed when one of his aunts suggested he needed to apologize to me, how he'd blamed me for making him look bad by refusing to talk about the pregnancy, how he'd shown zero understanding of why his behavior was wrong. 3 weeks before our scheduled custody hearing, there was a pre-trial conference with both lawyers and the judge to discuss procedural matters and see if there was any possibility of settlement. David's lawyer attempted to negotiate for immediate unsupervised visitation, arguing that David deserved to bond with his daughter and shouldn't be punished any longer. Catherine shut that down fast, presenting evidence of David's restraining order violation when he hadn't removed all the social media posts within the required time frame, showing the judge screenshots of posts that had stayed up for 36 hours instead of 24. Catherine also presented the photos of David living with his girlfriend and argued that he represented a potential flight risk given his demonstrated willingness to lie and manipulate. She told the judge that David had already shown he would do or say anything to get what he wanted, including trying to bribe his own brother to commit perjury, and that Emma's safety required continued supervised visitation only. The judge looked through the evidence Catherine presented, and I could see her expression getting harder and more closed off as she reviewed photo after photo, and she agreed to keep the supervision order in place until after the full hearing. 2 days after that conference, a woman I'd never met called Catherine's office, identifying herself as Patricia Morrison, wife of David's boss at his company. Mrs. Morrison said she wanted to provide a statement about the baby shower at the country club, about what my sister had told her regarding David's disgusting comment, about how Jennifer hadn't even known about the shower because David never mentioned it to his own mother. Her statement corroborated everything we'd already said about David's complete disconnection from the pregnancy and his family's awareness of the situation. That same afternoon, my bank's fraud department called me about unusual activity on the joint account David and I still shared. And when I logged in to check, I discovered that David had withdrawn every single penny, $23,000, on the day after Emma was born while I was still in the hospital recovering. The bank showed me the withdrawal slip with David's signature and the teller's notes that he'd said he needed the money for a family emergency, which was apparently code for cleaning out our savings while his wife was incapacitated. Catherine filed financial abuse charges immediately and petitioned for a freeze on all of David's personal accounts. And she told me this showed his true priorities and character in a way that would be very clear to any judge. You don't empty your family's savings the day after your child is born unless you're planning something malicious, unless you're trying to hurt your spouse and gain some kind of leverage. The next morning, I woke up to pounding on my parents' front door around 7:30. And when my dad looked through the peephole, there was a woman standing on the porch screaming about how I was keeping David away from his baby. My dad told her through the door to leave, but she just kept yelling about father's rights and what a terrible mother I was, accusing me of being vindictive and cruel. My mom quickly took Emma upstairs away from the noise while my dad called 911 and explained that a stranger was harassing us in violation of the restraining order. The police arrived within minutes, and when they questioned the woman, she tried to explain she was just concerned about David's parental rights and wanted to support him. The officers ran her information through their system and discovered that, yes, she was specifically named in the restraining order as someone who needed to stay away from me and my family. They arrested her right there on our front porch while neighbors peeked through their curtains watching this whole scene unfold, and she kept screaming David's name as they put her in the back of the patrol car. Later that day, we found out this was Stephanie, the woman David had been living with since Emma's birth, and her arrest made the local 6 o'clock news. Reporters stood outside my parents' house talking about a custody dispute that had escalated to an arrest for restraining order violation. And while they didn't use names on air, everyone in our town knew it was about David because word had spread through the community like wildfire. His coworkers saw the news report and started putting together all the pieces of his lies and manipulation. David's company called him in the next day and put him on administrative leave while they investigated his conduct. Because having your girlfriend arrested for harassing your wife on the news isn't exactly a good look for a professional workplace. His lawyer tried to withdraw from the case at that point, showing up at the courthouse and telling the judge he couldn't in good conscience continue representing someone who kept lying to him and making his job impossible. But the judge looked at the calendar, saw we were less than 2 weeks from the full custody hearing, and said absolutely not. You're stuck with this client and you'll see the case through to completion. The look on David's lawyer's face was priceless. Catherine told me later, like he'd just been sentenced to something terrible because now he had to represent a client he didn't believe in and didn't trust. Catherine loved this development because it meant David's own lawyer would be half-hearted at best in defending him, already convinced of his client's dishonesty. We scheduled depositions for the week before the hearing, and Catherine started with David's secretary, a nervous middle-aged woman who came in looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. But once Catherine got her talking, she answered every question honestly and thoroughly. She testified that David never mentioned the pregnancy at work, never talked about preparing for fatherhood, never seemed excited or anxious or any of the normal emotions expectant fathers display. When she'd heard I was in labor and told David, she said he'd looked completely confused, like he'd forgotten I was even pregnant. The secretary said she'd actually thought David and I were separated for months because he never mentioned a wife or baby at home. And when he did occasionally leave work early, it was always for golf tournaments or happy hours with clients, never for prenatal appointments or baby-related errands. She signed a sworn statement covering all of this, and her testimony painted David as someone completely detached from his impending fatherhood. The country club where my baby shower had been held sent over their complete records without us even having to formally request them with a subpoena, and these records were damning in their thoroughness. They showed David's attendance at every single golf game during my entire 9-month pregnancy, not one single absence or missed tee time. The records included his signature on scorecards and bar tabs, proof he'd been there playing 18 holes and drinking with friends while I was going through prenatal appointments alone. Catherine created a side-by-side comparison of the country club's golf schedule and my medical records showing 32 different prenatal appointments that David never attended, and the pattern was impossible to deny or explain away. Every time I had a doctor's visit, David was on a golf course, and the documentation proved it beyond any shadow of doubt. My mother came to court for a preliminary hearing about what evidence would be admissible at the full trial, And she testified about our 4 years of fertility treatments and how happy David had seemed initially when we finally got pregnant. Described in painful detail how his attitude changed completely once I started showing, how he went from excited to disgusted almost overnight, like a switch had been flipped in his brain. The judge took careful notes while my mom talked about David avoiding physical contact with me, refusing to touch my growing belly, turning away from ultrasound pictures like they were something shameful instead of images of his daughter. David sat there in the courtroom shaking his head in denial, but the judge saw right through it. I could tell from the way she was looking at him with this expression of barely concealed disgust. When Catherine started presenting the evidence about the hospital recording, David actually looked smug for a minute, like he thought this was his ace in the hole. The proof that I deliberately kept him away from Emma's birth. His lawyer played the audio clip where I admitted I didn't call him when I went into labor, and David was practically smiling until Catherine stood up with her own laptop. She played the full, unedited recording, not just the snippet David wanted the court to hear, and everyone in the courtroom listened to David's calculated tone, his immediate threats about custody, his concern for legal strategy rather than for his newborn daughter's health and well-being. The contrast between the two versions was stark, and the judge's face got progressively harder as she listened to David threatening me mere hours after I'd given birth, instead of asking about Emma or showing any normal parental concern or emotion. When the full recording finished playing, the judge looked at David with obvious revulsion, and I knew in that moment that he'd just destroyed whatever credibility he might have had with her. Catherine then presented our final evidence package showing that David had never purchased a single item for Emma. Not one thing in 9 months of pregnancy. No crib, no clothes, no diapers, no bottles, no blankets, nothing. His credit card statements told the real story of his priorities, showing charges for expensive restaurants and golf fees and gifts for Stephanie, but not one baby store or children's shop. He had receipts for everything I'd bought alone while David was spending our money on his girlfriend, and every purchase showed where his priorities really were. And none of them involved preparing for his daughter's arrival. Catherine's investigator had found that David bought Stephanie a $400 necklace the exact same week I went into premature labor. And he'd taken her to a 5-star steakhouse the night I was admitted to the hospital on bed rest, and these kinds of specific, damning details were impossible for him to explain away or justify. Jennifer took the witness stand 2 weeks later, and I watched her hands shake as she held the Bible to be sworn in, and I could see she was nervous but also determined to tell the truth about her son's behavior. She testified that David had called me hormonal and dramatic when she'd asked about the pregnancy after that Sunday dinner confrontation, that he'd convinced her I was overreacting and making a big deal out of nothing. And she'd believed him because he was her son and she wanted to trust him. Broke down crying when she described realizing the truth, finding out about my baby shower from my mother instead of from David, understanding that he'd never mentioned buying anything for Emma or preparing a nursery or doing any of the normal things expectant fathers do. The judge took extensive notes while Jennifer testified, and David's lawyer kept trying to object to various parts of her testimony, but there was nothing objectionable about a mother simply telling the truth about what her son had said and done. After Jennifer finished, David wouldn't even make eye contact with her, just sat there staring at the table with his jaw clenched, and she left the courtroom sobbing while his lawyer requested a 15-minute recess. The guardian ad litem, a court-appointed representative whose job was to evaluate what would be best for Emma, spent 3 full days observing me with her at my parents' house. She watched me change diapers and mix formula and rock Emma when she was fussy. She saw me get up at 2 in the morning for night feedings and sing lullabies and play with Emma during tummy time. She interviewed my parents about their support system, talked to my neighbors about what kind of mother I was, called Emma's pediatrician to discuss her health and development, and reviewed every single receipt and document showing I'd been solely responsible for providing everything Emma needed. Her official report came back strongly recommending that I retain primary physical and legal custody of Emma, and it specifically mentioned concerning patterns of detachment and neglect in David's behavior throughout the prenatal period. She wrote that Emma was thriving under my care, that I'd created a stable and nurturing environment despite the stress of the custody proceedings, and that disrupting Emma's current placement would not serve her best interests. This recommendation from a neutral court-appointed professional was exactly what we needed to counter David's narrative. Stephanie apparently didn't enjoy being charged with violating the restraining order because she started calling witnesses on our list, trying to intimidate them into not testifying. Left threatening voicemails for 3 different nurses who'd been in the hospital room when David made his recording. And she contacted my sister through social media with barely veiled threats about what would happen if Rebecca showed up in court. The prosecutor added witness intimidation charges to Stephanie's existing case, and she got arrested at her workplace while news cameras just happened to be there to film it. David had to watch his girlfriend get walked out of her office building in handcuffs while local news anchors talked about the escalating custody dispute, and I imagine that must have been humiliating for him. Though not as humiliating as what he'd put me through. During David's deposition, which happened over 6 grueling hours in Catherine's conference room, he sat there sweating through his shirt while Catherine asked him question after question about the pregnancy. He admitted he'd found pregnancy gross, but kept insisting we were taking it out of context, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded, that everyone was twisting his words to make him look bad. Catherine methodically went through every piece of evidence showing him avoiding me for 9 straight months. And after each one, she would ask him calmly to please explain this particular instance. And he couldn't. He just kept contradicting himself and getting tangled up in his own lies. He said first that I never told him about prenatal appointments, then later admitted I had invited him, but he thought golf was more important for his networking and career. The court reporter typed every word of his testimony, creating a permanent record of his contradictions and excuses. When Catherine's assistant was organizing evidence for the hearing, she found something absolutely incredible in the documents David's lawyer had been required to provide during discovery. David's browser history from his laptop showed he'd been searching for custody lawyers and reading articles about parental alienation tactics 3 weeks before I even went into labor with Emma. He'd bookmarked pages about how to get full custody and downloaded template forms for emergency custody orders while I was still in my 3rd trimester, and he was supposedly unaware that he'd done anything wrong. This evidence showed premeditation and planning, that David had been setting me up for a custody fight before Emma was even born, that his recording in the hospital wasn't a spontaneous reaction, but part of a calculated strategy he'd been developing for weeks. The timestamps on these searches and downloads proved everything happened right after he'd told me to stop talking about the pregnancy. Like he'd already decided how this was all going to play out and was just executing his plan step by step. The judge ordered psychological evaluations for both of us, which meant spending 4 hours with a court-appointed psychologist, answering hundreds of personal questions, and taking standardized tests. My evaluation came back completely clean, showing normal stress responses appropriate to my situation, but no signs of mental illness, depression, instability, or anything else that would impact my ability to parent Emma safely and effectively. The psychologist noted that I was dealing with appropriate and reasonable stress given the legal proceedings and harassment I'd experienced, and that this was a situational issue rather than a personality disorder or mental health condition. David's psychological evaluation told a very different story, identifying narcissistic personality traits and a profound inability to accept responsibility for his own actions and their consequences. The psychologist wrote that David consistently blamed others for problems he himself had created, showed no genuine remorse or empathy for the pain he'd caused, and viewed the custody battle as a competition to win rather than as a situation requiring focus on what would be best for Emma. The report specifically mentioned concern about David's capacity to put Emma's needs ahead of his own ego and desire for control. David's workplace finished their internal investigation after interviewing everyone who worked with him and reviewing security footage of Stephanie's arrest in their parking lot, and they terminated his employment for cause. The official termination letter mentioned creation of a hostile work environment and lying about his family situation to manipulate coworkers' sympathies, and it referenced damage to the company's reputation from having an employee involved in such a public and ugly custody dispute. Without his job, David couldn't afford to pay his lawyer's next billing installment, and the lawyer filed yet another motion to withdraw from representation. The judge still wouldn't let him quit because we were too close to the final hearing, but she did require David to pay the outstanding legal fees up front before his lawyer would continue working. His own Jennifer, she came, Catherine, David, his father, the final. David took the stand on the second day and tried to paint himself as a victim of a vindictive ex-wife who'd turned everyone against him through lies and manipulation. He claimed I'd deliberately kept him from bonding with Emma from the moment she was born, that I'd poisoned his own family against him, that he'd done nothing wrong except maybe speak harshly in a moment of frustration during my pregnancy. Catherine began her cross-examination very calmly, asking David to explain specific events and statements, and within 5 minutes, he was already raising his voice and showing the anger that was always just beneath his surface. The judge had to warn him twice about his courtroom behavior and inappropriate tone, but he couldn't seem to control himself when Catherine kept presenting piece after piece of evidence and asking him to explain each one. She showed him the golf records and asked why he'd attended every single game instead of prenatal appointments. She showed him credit card statements and asked why he'd spent money on his girlfriend instead of his daughter. David's face turned progressively redder as the cross-examination continued, and he gripped the witness stand so hard his knuckles went white. And when Catherine asked him to explain the text messages about being glad I was staying at my parents' house so he could game all night, he completely lost it. He started shouting that everyone was twisting everything to make him look bad, that it was all a conspiracy against him, that none of this was fair, and the judge banged her gavel and ordered him to control himself or be removed from his own hearing. When it was finally my turn to testify, I walked slowly to the witness stand holding Emma, who was 6 months old by then and starting to recognize familiar faces and smile at people she knew. I settled into the chair with Emma in my arms, and I told the court about that Saturday morning in June when David had slammed his coffee mug and told me my pregnancy disgusted him and I needed to stop talking about it completely. My voice cracked as I described how those words felt like being stabbed after 4 years of trying for this baby, after all the treatments and disappointments and hope that we'd finally achieved our dream together. I explained to the judge how I'd made the conscious decision to take David at his word, to follow his instructions exactly as he'd given them, to simply stop mentioning the pregnancy since he found it so disgusting and boring. I described staying at my parents' house and following his directive to the letter, and how terrified I'd been when he showed up at the hospital with that recording and his calculating smile and his threats about custody. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for Emma making small baby noises, and I could see several people in the gallery wiping their eyes. Catherine asked me how I'd felt during those months of silence and isolation, and I said I'd felt completely alone and terrified that the man I'd married and loved had become someone I didn't recognize anymore, someone who could be cruel for no reason and then pretend to be the victim. Talked about lying in that hospital bed on bed rest, wondering how I was going to protect my baby from her own father, and several jurors and observers nodded like they understood exactly what I meant. David's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive during his cross-examination, suggesting I deliberately misinterpreted David's words and used them as an excuse to cut him out of Emma's life. But I stayed calm and just repeated the facts, pointed to the witnesses who'd seen and heard everything, referenced the mountain of evidence that showed David's true character and priorities. Catherine had prepared me well for this, and I didn't let the lawyer rattle me or put words in my mouth. After 3 days of testimony from dozens of witnesses, the judge said she needed time to carefully review all the evidence and would deliver her custody decision the following morning. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, just lay in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house holding Emma and trying not to think about the possibility of losing her, of having this beautiful, perfect little girl taken away because of David's manipulations. My parents sat with me for hours, assuring me that justice would prevail, that the truth was clear, that no judge could look at all that evidence and give David custody. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before, standing room only with people who'd come to hear the verdict in this custody case that had captured local attention. David sat at his table looking confident, almost smug, like he actually believed he was going to win, like he thought his lawyer's arguments had somehow overcome the mountain of evidence against him. I sat with Catherine holding Emma, trying to keep my hands from shaking, and my parents were right behind me in the first row of gallery seats. The judge entered and everyone stood, and then she began speaking in this measured professional tone that gave away nothing of what she was about to say. She started by noting she'd reviewed all the evidence very carefully, all the testimony from witnesses, all the documents and recordings and photographs, everything presented by both sides during 3 days of proceedings. Then her tone shifted slightly, became harder, and she said that David's behavior during the pregnancy showed a clear and concerning pattern of emotional abuse and willful neglect that deeply troubled her as both a judge and a mother. She granted me full legal and physical custody of Emma, with David receiving only supervised visitation on a limited schedule contingent on him completing mandatory parenting classes and anger management therapy. David jumped to his feet immediately and started screaming that I'd ruined his life, that I'd stolen his daughter, that this was all a conspiracy and the system was rigged against fathers. The judge banged her gavel hard and warned him to sit down, be quiet, but he just kept yelling about how unfair everything was, how he'd done nothing wrong, how everyone had turned against him. 2 bailiffs moved quickly to grab David's arms as the judge held him in contempt of court and ordered him removed from the courtroom, and he was still screaming about injustice and lies as they literally dragged him out through the back door in handcuffs. Emma stayed peaceful through the whole thing, just looking around calmly like she somehow knew she was safe with me, and I held her close and cried tears of relief and gratitude. The days and weeks after the custody decision brought their own challenges. Because David spent weeks in jail for contempt of court before being released with strict conditions about his behavior. Catherine called me 2 weeks later to tell me that David still hadn't signed up for any of the court-ordered parenting classes or anger management therapy, that he was continuing to be defiant and non-compliant even though it was costing him any chance at increased visitation. She documented everything meticulously in case David tried later to petition for modified custody arrangements, building a paper trail of his refusal to follow court orders. Stephanie showed up at my parents' house about a month after the hearing, and I almost didn't recognize her at first because she looked so different. Smaller somehow and less aggressive than when she'd been screaming on our porch before her arrest. She had a handwritten letter apologizing for everything, saying she'd had no idea what the real story was, that David had told her I was crazy and vindictive and keeping him from his baby daughter for no reason. She said she'd believed every lie because she was in love with him and wanted his version of events to be true, but after sitting through some of the custody hearings, she realized he'd been manipulating her the entire time. I told Stephanie that I didn't blame her for believing David because he was very good at manipulation and playing the victim, and she looked so relieved that I wasn't angry at her that she started crying. She said she'd broken up with David after the hearing and moved to a different city to get away from the whole situation. And I wished her well because she'd been as much a victim of David's lies as I had been in some ways. Jennifer called every week wanting to visit Emma and make sure we were doing okay. And I always said yes because none of this was her fault and she'd been nothing but supportive throughout the entire ordeal. She would bring little gifts for Emma, age-appropriate toys and cute outfits, and she never once tried to defend David or make excuses for his behavior. Jennifer told me she'd stopped speaking to David entirely after he'd screamed at her about betraying him, and she said she was heartbroken that her son had turned out this way, but she wouldn't let that interfere with her relationship with her granddaughter. It took David 8 months to finally complete all the court-ordered therapy and parenting classes. And even then, it was only because his lawyer told him he'd never get unsupervised visitation otherwise. His therapist contacted Dr. Chen to discuss creating a safe transition plan for supervised visits at a family center, and they scheduled the first visit for a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. David showed up 23 minutes late without calling to explain, and he spent most of the hour-long visit complaining to the social worker supervisor about how unfair the supervision requirement was instead of actually engaging with Emma. The social worker wrote in her report that David seemed more focused on his grievances about the custody arrangement than on building a relationship with his daughter. And Emma had cried for most of the visit and kept reaching for me whenever David tried to hold her. The pattern continued through the next several supervised visits, with David arguing about rules and barely interacting with Emma in any meaningful way. And after the fifth failed visit, the supervisor recommended extending the supervision period indefinitely because David wasn't showing any progress. Around this time, I started attending a single-parent support group at our community center, and that's where I met someone I'll call James, though that's not his real name. James was raising his young son alone after losing his wife to cancer 2 years earlier, and he was kind and patient and never pushed for anything more than friendship at first. Emma loved him immediately, giggling and smiling whenever he made funny faces at her during the support group meetings, and we started getting coffee together afterward while our kids played on the playground. James listened without judgment as I told him about the custody battle and David's behavior, and he shared his own story of loss and learning to be both mother and father to his son. After a few months, we started officially dating, taking things very slowly and respectfully because we both had children to consider, and I was still healing from everything David had put me through. James never complained when I had to cancel plans because Emma was sick or when David's drama interfered with our time together. He just rolled with whatever came up and supported me unconditionally. David found out about James when he saw us together at the grocery store one Saturday, James helping me load bags into my car while Emma giggled at him from her car seat. David took photos on his phone and filed an emergency motion the very next day, claiming I was exposing Emma to dangerous strangers and putting her at risk. Catherine called me laughing about it because she said David's lawyer had actually tried to talk him out of filing such a ridiculous motion, but David had insisted. At the emergency hearing 2 weeks later, the judge looked at David's evidence, which consisted entirely of photos of us grocery shopping like normal people, and she actually asked if he was serious about this being an emergency. David started ranting about how I was trying to replace him as Emma's father and confuse her about who her real parent was. And the judge cut him off sharply to remind him that supervised visitation existed because of his own documented behavior, not because of anything I'd done. She dismissed the motion and warned David that if he filed another frivolous claim, she would consider financial sanctions against him. 6 months after Emma's first birthday, Jennifer had a massive stroke and passed away within 3 days despite everything the hospital tried to do. At the funeral, David sat in the front row looking appropriately sad but also expectant, like he was waiting for something. And at the will reading afterward, he clearly expected to inherit something substantial from his mother. But the lawyer reading the will skipped right over David's name and announced that everything was going into the trust for Emma that Jennifer had established. And the will specifically stated David was excluded due to his treatment of his pregnant wife. David stood up and started yelling that I had poisoned his mother against him, that I'd manipulated a dying woman, that this wasn't fair, but his own father told him to sit down and shut up or leave the lawyer's office. The trust included Jennifer's house, which was paid off, her investment portfolio worth almost $2 million, and a sealed letter to Emma explaining why her father wasn't included, to be opened when Emma turned 18. David spent months trying to contest the will, hiring lawyers and filing motions, but everyone told him he had no case because Jennifer had been very clear about her intentions and her reasons. David finally completed all his therapy requirements and got approved for unsupervised visits every other weekend. And the first Saturday, I packed Emma's diaper bag with detailed written instructions for feeding schedules and nap times and everything he would need to know. He picked her up at 9 in the morning looking nervous, and by noon, he was calling me in a panic because Emma had a dirty diaper and he couldn't remember how to change it properly. I told him to figure it out and hung up, and 20 minutes later, he called again because Emma was crying and wouldn't take her bottle the way she usually did with me. Then he called because she needed a nap but wouldn't sleep in the portable crib he'd borrowed, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he brought her back early, claiming she must be sick because she'd been so fussy all day. The next visit lasted until Sunday morning before he called saying he couldn't handle the night feeding schedule and please could I come get her early. This pattern continued for months, with David rarely making it through an entire weekend before bringing Emma back early with various excuses about her being difficult or sick or just needing her mother. After almost 2 years of dating, James proposed to me at the park where we'd first taken Emma and his son to play together on a sunny afternoon in spring. Emma was walking by then, toddling around on chubby legs, and James had taught her to carry the ring box to me as part of his proposal plan. She walked over carefully in her little yellow sundress and handed me the box saying "Mama Pretty" in her sweet 2-year-old voice. And everyone at the park who saw what was happening started clapping and cheering. We planned a simple ceremony in my parents' backyard with just close family and friends, maybe 50 people total, and it was perfect and intimate and everything I'd hoped for. David obviously wasn't invited, but Jennifer's widower, David's father, asked if he could come because he wanted to celebrate this new chapter for his granddaughter. The ceremony was beautiful, with Emma walking down the makeshift aisle, throwing flower petals everywhere except the runner we'd laid out, and James's son following behind her as ring bearer, trying to keep her on track. David found out about the wedding from social media posts and sent a series of nasty, angry messages. But we just forwarded them all to Catherine for her records in case they were needed for future proceedings. About 6 months after the wedding, David met someone new, a dental hygienist from his workplace. And after 3 months of dating her, he filed yet another petition for increased custody, claiming he was now in a stable relationship and could provide a better environment for Emma. Catherine responded with our extensive documentation of his pattern of failed visits and early returns and panicked phone calls about basic parenting tasks. And the judge denied his request without even requiring a full hearing. The dental hygienist apparently found out the real truth about David's past during the custody proceeding because she dumped him immediately afterward and he was back to being single again. By Emma's 3rd birthday party, David had finally stopped fighting every single issue and seemed to accept his every other weekend schedule without constant complaints and emergency motions. He paid his child support on time through automatic bank withdrawal, and he stopped sending angry emails about every little perceived slight. At Emma's birthday party that year, he dropped off a present without making a scene and left peacefully after saying hello to a few people, which was the first time he'd acted completely normal since this whole ordeal had started years earlier. Started nursing school during the custody battle, taking night classes while my mom watched Emma, determined to build a stable career that would support my daughter properly without depending on anyone else. James helped me study for exams and took care of both Emma and his son when I had late classes or early clinical rotations. After 3 grueling years of balancing single motherhood and school and a new relationship, I graduated with honors and got a job at our local hospital's pediatric ward. Emma sat in the audience at my graduation ceremony wearing a tiny handmade graduation cap that James had crafted for her. And when they called my name, she stood up and yelled, "Mama did it so loud that the entire auditorium heard her and burst out laughing." Jennifer's widower was there taking pictures and crying happy tears, telling everyone around him how proud he was of me and what I'd accomplished despite everything I'd been through. 2 months after my graduation, David called Catherine asking to schedule a meeting about something important, and when we all sat down together in Catherine's conference room, David looked tired and defeated in a way I'd never seen before. He said he wanted to terminate his parental rights if I would waive the back child support he owed from several periods of unemployment when he'd missed payments. James had already told me he wanted to adopt Emma officially and give her his last name. And David knew this was probably inevitable anyway, given how little relationship he'd built with her over the years. We signed the papers that day, David walking away from Emma's life forever in exchange for financial relief. And 6 months later, James's adoption went through with a judge signing the final decree. Emma had already been calling James daddy for almost a year by then. And when we told her that now it was official and legal, she just smiled and said, "I know," and went back to playing with her dolls like this had been obvious to her all along. Looking back on everything now, years later, I can see how each terrible moment led to something better. How David's cruelty ultimately freed me to find real love and build the family Emma deserved. Sometimes the hardest paths lead us exactly where we need to be, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up being the ones who push us toward the life we were always meant to live. Thank you so much for listening to my story, for spending this time with me as I shared one of the most difficult and transformative periods of my life. And if any part of this resonated with you or reminded you of your own struggles, I hope you know you're not alone and that better things are waiting just around the corner if you can hold on through the darkness. I'll see you again soon with more stories and conversations. And until then, take care of yourself and know that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you rise above their treatment and build something beautiful anyway. If this story touched you, please consider leaving a like or subscribing, because your support means everything and helps me continue sharing these real-life journeys we all navigate together. Be well, and remember that tomorrow is always a new day, filled with new possibilities.